you guys, we should be going live on all the platforms. All of them take slightly different amount of time to actually start the live stream. I'm just going to check real quick to make sure, and then I'm going to share my screen and explain a little bit about what we're doing here today. Let's see, and I think, yep, we are live on Twitch at least, so cool. Okay, so we are here today with Dr. Carla Ionescu to talk about her book, She Who Hunts. Yay.
Yay.
So really quick before we get started, as always, we introduce SASA a little bit. And also I am the host today, Lauren Kubosch. I run SASA's communication and live events team. But what is SASA? SASA stands for Safe Ancient Studies Alliance. It's our mission to reverse the current downward trend in the study of the ancient world by engaging students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generation of students. So we do this in a lot of ways, like these kinds of live streams, talking to authors. We also stream every Friday with Archeo Gaming, playing video games that are connected to ancient history. We do research on the downward trend and mini research projects. We have an open access database that's a searchable database of ancient studies sources and a million more things, a virtual conference, etc. Where you can find SASA, if you search Save Ancient Studies Alliance, basically anywhere you can find us. Please do follow and subscribe on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, LinkedIn, etc. It's just some protocol for a live event. Please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions. We would love to get your questions in the chat, so please do send them in. All of the platforms have chat features for you to be able to do that. These streams will be saved on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. And of course, have fun. Last but not least, it is going to be our birthday bash fundraiser starting on Monday, and we have a raffle going on in the fundraiser to have a private meet and greet with Dr. Cara Cooney, who is an Egyptologist who works at UCLA and has done work with Nat Geo. Basically, every $25 donated will get you one raffle ticket, so $50 would be 2 raffle tickets, etc. And then we will be picking names on the last day of our birthday bash, which will be April 23rd. And if you're the winner, you can invite up to 10 friends to this session. So we are very excited about that raffle. You can also become a recurring donor for as little as $3 a month through PayPal or through Twitch. And of course, thank you for joining us, and we'll get started with our event.
Yay.
Okay, so very quickly, let me introduce our wonderful guest, Dr. Carla Ionescu. She researches, or her research, centers on the influential nature of Artemis, which is who the book She Who Hunts is specifically about, the Greek goddess Artemis, both in the Greek world and in the Near East. She's a leading expert on the worship and rituals of Artemis, and she teaches in the field of ancient history and women's studies, as well as developing the Artemis Center and the Goddess Project, which I will let her explain a little bit more to you. I definitely have to shout out Ancient History Hound podcast, because that is where I found Dr. Ionescu and this book, and we contacted her and set up this stream. So shout out to Ancient History Hounds.
Yeah.
And with that, I will let you introduce yourself a little bit before we dig into some questions about the book.
Perfect. Okay. So as you said, Lauren, my name is Dr. Carla Ionescu, and I teach at York University in Toronto, which is where I am now. There's this massive lecture hall here that is now empty because it's Saturday and it's exam season. So I thought, oh, perfect. On campus on Saturday to do a live. It works. I wrote the book She Who Hunts. I've been working on Artemis for about 12 to 15 years. And as a graduate student, and then of course as a doctoral student for my PhD. And I have upcoming books on her, more research on her. In fact, I think my entire world evolves around her now, which is wonderful. And what else? I do the Goddess Project podcast, which is something that I started just last year, talking about all the goddess things in the divine feminine. And I run the Artemis Center, the Artemis Research Center, which is right now a virtual center. And through there, we have some courses that are available. And then there'll be more courses they're called Goddess Basics courses, which is basically short little 1 week, 1 hour, 2 hour courses on different goddesses. We also do goddess travel. So we do lots of goddess things through the Artemis Center. But one day in the future, I hope for it to be a real place in Crete, Greece, on the island of Crete.
Ooh.
Yeah, where people can come and learn and do workshops and retreats and stay. And we can go to the archaeological sites of the Artemis temples, both in Crete and across Greece. And so that is the sort of end goal. So we're starting online virtually, but the end goal will be like an actual beautiful center with a temple space for Artemis that will hopefully.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I love that. Can I ask why Crete specifically? I think I might have an idea, but
well, so originally I went to Crete because it had so many Artemis sites, right? So many Artemis and Ariadne sites and all of this, right? There's this Minoan civilization that Artemis may have been a part of in the early period. But when I went there, I had such a visceral reaction to the island. It was like I had been there for, you know, 1,000 years or whatever, you know? And so, yeah, it seems to be the case that Crete is the place. I think.
I love that. Yeah, right. Who knows what will come? But I feel that I stayed in Crete for about a month when I was in my undergrad too, and it was a very wonderful, magical place. So
that's amazing, right?
Yeah.
It has a feel on that island, I think.
Yeah, and it's a good island feel of not really the biggest city, still isn't really a big city. And
exactly.
It's great. It's great.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's dig into just a few more questions about you. But also, side note, I did send in the chat the link to the Artemis Center and also the link to your link tree. So you can find all of these great things that we're talking about in that link tree. I'll send it at the end as well.
Thanks.
Yes, of course. So firstly, the usual questions that people always ask you of what do you study specifically and why do you love ancient history? Why did you choose to study ancient history?
Okay. So ancient history was not my original choice. I actually went into university to study psych and law. And I thought, okay, these are the two things. And then I did psych and law and I worked in those fields for a little bit. And I thought, this is not really for me. I guess I had always wanted to study archaeology and ancient history, but it seemed like, you wanted to get a degree where you could work and get a job and all those things, right? And so my parents were very, dedicated to either, psychiatry of some kind or law and all that kind of stuff. So when I told my father that I was not going to go into that and I thought I would go into archaeology and ancient history, he was like, how are you going to eat? What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Right. So, and I thought, I don't know, but it's really something that I enjoy doing. And if I'm going to spend 10, 12 years doing it, I would really like to do that. And so I've always been fascinated by mythology, goddess work, all that kind of stuff. And then when I entered grad school, it was, you have to find something that is unique, something that hasn't really been studied, something that doesn't get a lot of attention. And so I went through some of I wanted to do something Greco-Roman that sort of speaks to my heritage as a, Romanian woman. And so I thought, okay, what can I do? And I came across Artemis and I kind of started down that rabbit hole of her worship. And as I was doing some research on her worship, I realized that she was more and more fascinating as I rolled into more and more of her rituals. And then I realized that not a lot of people were working on her, academically speaking, And so I thought this is, so in a weird way, initially, it was like a tool to be able to get my PhD in ancient history.
Yeah.
But then as I started digging more and doing more research and connecting to some of that stuff, I just started feeling a bit more defensive of her. I was like, no one is looking at her.
Right.
She's fascinating. And all of these rituals were happening. And then I just kept finding more and more stuff about her. And I thought, oh no, this is definitely mine. This is definitely my calling. And so I began to study her temples, her rituals, symbols, anything that had to do with her practices. And I realized that this was a space that no one was really paying any attention to in academia. And so then, I just get pulled more and more in. And by the time I was doing my dissertation, I was like the Artemis defender,
Yeah. I love that. That's that was perfect for your dissertation. Um, yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's true, and it's interesting because she is one of the like 12 Olympian gods. So you would think
Right?
that she would still be in this category of the most studied gods because there's so many other ones too.
Yeah.
But the Olympian gods are the most popular, the most well known. But then still, she's not on this level of people making a point to study her specifically, which I agree with. I have my undergrad degrees in classical civilizations, and of course I've heard of Artemis and did little things on Artemis and read places in Homer that talk about Artemis and the Iliad
Right.
or whatever, but it wasn't ever really specifically about her and her influence in the classical Greek world.
Yeah.
So I love that. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, my next questions were about the Artemis Center and the Goddess Project. You already talked about that a little bit. And I guess slightly more specifically, why did you decide to write She Who Hunts? Which is, I will say, it is a nice, I'm not much of a reader, you guys, so it is a nice and pretty short book. So it was a pretty quick read. It's very interesting. You touch on a lot of different aspects about Artemis worship, like you said, worship, representation, temples, etc.
Yeah. So I have so much research, I'm actually just moving now. I'm moving places and I have boxes and boxes and boxes of research, and never mind what's on my laptop. Right. And so when I started, at first I thought, you know what, I'm going to write just all about Artemis and I'm going to show everybody what a massively awesome goddess she is and how overlooked she is. And then I realized that it was going to be a 500, 600 page work. And one of the things that I wanted to do was write it in an academic way, but not just for academics, right? Because I think one of my passions, and I think that comes from teaching my students, is that I want everybody to be able to access this material, but also that it's primary source material, primary and secondary source, but it's referenced material. And so I thought to myself, well, if I was just myself and I myself picked up a book on an ancient goddess, would I pick up a 500-page book? I mean, I did. I have a few. But, even me, like, it just takes me forever. And then you got to, get through it. Plus, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
And so I thought, what if I split her up by regions? And so I would start with the Greek, which is what She Who Hunts is. And because everyone's familiar with the Greek, and I would kind of almost initiate them into the realities of the worship of Artemis versus what we've been told by like Disney and whatever. And then once people enjoy that, perhaps the next book, which I'm working on, Ephesus, they'll be like, oh, Carla wrote that book and it was pretty good. It wasn't too long. I think I got through it. Maybe I can now read this Ephesus book, let's say, about Artemis. And then maybe I can read another one about her in Sicily and Italy. And then maybe I can read another one about her in the Balkans and things like that. Yeah. So I think it's more digestible that way. It was easier that way.
Yeah.
Right.
I definitely agree. Even for me, again, having a background in classics, but you're right. You did it in a scholarly way that is using all of these primary and secondary sources that are legitimate sources to be using, and touching on these topics that are like bringing up questions in my head that then your next books will like help answer some of that stuff. Right. So that's a really cool way to do it. Yeah.
Right. And, between you and me and whoever's watching this, that also allows me to apply for funding to travel to the sites.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that now adding photographs in books is very, very expensive. And so this is why I do like, Instagram and TikTok and stuff like that, because then I can put those images on there and people can.
That's smart. And actually, as we were just talking about before we started the stream, to talk about the artwork of the cover of your book and stuff, but also touching on that's something that I haven't really, of course it makes sense, but I haven't really had an author talk about that before, of how expensive it is to put photographs and things and get the right licensing for it and all of that. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I have so many photographs because, because she was not as studied as other goddesses, I had to go to the sites myself.
Right.
And then I had to kind of go dig around. I love to do. I mean, this is my favorite thing to do, but it takes time and you got to take a bunch of pictures and you got to kind of connect them. And I thought this would be great in a book. I mean, because I'm a visual learner, this would be fantastic in a book. And then when I was going to publish it, and I'm like, yeah, I have like maybe 50 pics or 60 pics. And the publisher's like, yeah, Carla, that book is going to be $200. Like,
yeah.
And I thought, no way. It was like, I don't know, $5 a picture or something like that, crazy like that. And then if it's
Yeah.
color, God forbid, like if it's color, it's
I
even
was
more.
gonna say, and then especially, and you'll see books sometimes where, like, in the middle of it, it has some pictures, and they're on like
Yeah.
shinier paper and whatever. Like, that that's the most expensive part.
Yeah. So then I thought, oh, dang it. Okay, no, because I want the book to be affordable for everybody, right? So I was like,
Mhm.
no. So then I started just posting it on IG and TikTok, and that's great. I mean, that gives me the
Yeah.
opportunity to interact with people too,
Right,
right?
exactly. I was gonna say exactly, and that's a lot of like what SASA does is meeting people where they're at. Like people who are marginally interested in this stuff don't know all the academic places to find this, and the places where they do scroll around and look around is TikTok, Instagram, whatever. So that's really a good way to reach those audiences by meeting them where they're at, and then you have so much more open to you of what you can do too. So that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's been so amazing because I will go to museums where I'm like looking for 3 pieces and then I will find 8, and I'll be
Mm-hmm.
so excited and I'm like, these have not been documented, and I'll make a bunch of videos about it, and I love that people then are like, oh my God, I hadn't seen these or I hadn't known about these. So it really like it keeps that excitement and passion and motivation going for me.
Yeah.
And it keeps me working and like going
Right.
out there, doing that.
Yeah. Love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now I think I'm going to dive into some more questions that are more specifically about the book because so I did read the whole thing. You guys be proud of me because I'm not much of a reader. But it was very good and very digestible. The chapters aren't super long and they're broken. I love that. I'm like one of those people that like stops when there's like breaks and things and whatever. So
Right.
you put lots of like breaks and things and to categorize what you're talking about, which was really helpful and great. So again, thank you. Um, but so one of the first things that I wanted to bring up was actually something in the preface that you wrote, where you're talking about using several different methodologies in your approach to the study of these ancient sources. And one of the main ones that you pointed out was neo-euhemerism, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was just, yeah, if you can explain that to the audience a little bit, and in the context of like how you use it to put together your research.
Right. So that's a really fancy word
Yeah.
for um it's a very PhD word for actually something that's really simple. So one of the challenges when I had proposed working on Artemis and talking about her rituals and her mythology, and then how that can be applied to everyday people, perhaps, in the Mediterranean. One of the challenges that my committee came up against was, well, it's myth. And so, how do you translate myth into real life? And then, how do you apply that to, real life people? Like, where's the connection between myth and what would be a real life situation? And
Right.
so, neo hermeneutics allows you to take the experience of the myth, take the experience of the people that are practicing that tradition, and use that as evidence
Mhm.
alongside material evidence and other types of evidence. And so, what I was able to do was argue that the very fact that the people who worshiped Artemis were so committed to her, and
Mhm.
that her worship was passed down in different ways depending on the villages and cities, the the very fact that that was happening, how do I say this, proves in an
Mhm.
academic way the significance of her symbology and of her myths. And that's what neo-hermeneutics is about. It's basically using hermeneutics, basically using the concept of mythology and of symbolism, but allowing you to use it as true evidence, because you can't really use a myth as evidence, right?
Right.
I mean, not in academia, you can't use a myth as evidence. So I can't say like, oh, Artemis was really born fully formed out of Leto and then she helped birth her brother. Like, that's the myth.
Right.
There's no evidence. She's not a real person, right? There's no
Right.
evidence. Yeah.
Right.
So that was the challenge, is like, so how do you use these pieces then as evidence in an academic work? And so that style, that methodology allowed me to not necessarily take the myth as fact, but take the fact that so many people practice these rituals around that myth as evidence. So it allowed me to do that, because I guess what I was really interested in was more about who was worshiping her, how loyal were they, why did they build, for example, in Ephesus, this massive temple that was, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and in other places, I mean, she has a small temple even at the Acropolis in Athens.
Right.
Well, she has several temples there, but she has one right at the bottom of the hill. Yeah, so like the importance of her. And so I guess I was really fascinated by the people, and I would have loved to have a conversation with these people and been like, is she first in your life? Is she above Athena? Is she above Demeter? Is that your favorite? And so there's no way to really measure that other than by like the quantity of temples and right? And the quantity of stories and things like that. But also how seriously are these stories applied to everyday life or to the life of worshipers. And so neurohermeneutics allows me the freedom to move around that in an academic setting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's something that I think, modern communities have a hard time wrapping their head around how ingrained these religious practices were in these communities. So that's a really good way to look at it, because this is these people's lives and what was important to them. So although, like you said, although she's not a real person that we can find her mummy, and whatever,
right,
like that.
right.
Oh, that's very interesting. Which actually, so what part of what you said about Athena, and again, you bring this up in your book too. So my next question, that kind of focuses on that is, and this is kind of specific, but do you think the success of Athens as a city-state is one of the main factors, like Athens in classical Greece as a city-state, their success is one of the main factors of why we now have this, what I feel like you would say is more of a skewed view of Athena being one, like the principal goddess deity? Like if it was some other city-state that had Artemis as their principal deity, would we think that she was, because that was what we consider the most successful one?
So my short answer is yes. A longer version of that answer is, I think that there are three goddesses that really get the attention of classicists and male classicists, and that is Athena, Demeter, and Aphrodite. But I think that they get the attention, and research speaking, that's what you'll find. You're going to find a ton of research on that. Every angle, every statue, everything has been researched. But I think those three goddesses represent something, an aspect of interest for men or for male classicists who began, of course, in archaeology and all that kind of stuff. So Athena, of course, represents politics and war, even though previously she had represented wisdom and other aspects. But, if we're talking about classical Athens, she's very much an androgynous war goddess, a defender of the city, all that kind of stuff. Aphrodite, of course, is sexuality, fertility, all these kinds of things. And so there's something sexy about Aphrodite. There's something, taboo about her. So there's a ton of material on her. And Demeter is the mothering, right? There's a lot of mothering going on. And that was very important for Greek citizens, for Greek women as well. But it was very much the procreation and propagation of Greek citizenship. Where Artemis, really what she does is she represents, Hera's up there too, which the wife of Zeus, but she doesn't actually get a lot of attention. Actually, Hera is a bit neglected, right? She's kind of she's turned into the nagging wife, and right. And so then we have Artemis, and Artemis has been a bit infantilized in classical research. She's a bit like, oh, she's the young girl hunting in the forest with her deer and all that kind of stuff. But actually, she's a really fierce and independent goddess. The Spartans worshipped her and bled themselves for her. This is a serious goddess, not some young teen. And there's a lot of ritual for her, and she's a goddess of the wild. So wild women, wild men, wilderness altogether. I don't know why early classicists did not find that as interesting as we do. Perhaps it's just the right time and place.
I think that's definitely part of it, especially because of how in the Western world, in the US in particular, we like these connections to Greek democracy and whatever, and then that's more connected to Athena.
Right.
So I think that is some of the aspects of why at least American classicists in the last whatever it is, like 100 years, 150 years, were focusing on more of that kind of stuff because it was more relatable to their audience population.
Yeah.
But like what was more relatable to the ancient Greek audience population might have
Right.
been Artemis more so than Athena outside of Athens. And like you said, even in Athens, they had multiple temples to Artemis and on
Yes.
the Acropolis, which is like Athena's
Yes.
end all
Yes,
be
in
all.
fact, they brought the statue of Artemis from Buran once a year to Athens, you know, and so I think she played a significantly larger role than we were led to believe. And I guess that's my goal right now in my research is to prove that. I mean, you have to prove that, Kadeem, right?
Also, slightly stemming from what you said, because you brought up, of course, Apollo. She's the twin sister of Apollo, and you do talk about Apollo in the book, but not super in detail because you're like focusing more on Artemis. So I definitely understand that. But it's interesting because Apollo is definitely one of the ones that is more studied and stuff and more popular, and they're twins, and she like helped give birth to him basically and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just thought that was really interesting. And it's like, so to us, Apollo's the more popular one. I mean, also Apollo is the one that's a little bit more connected with like Christian representations of things and stuff. So maybe that's part of what helped move Apollo over into like the modern mindset of things. But like would ancient Greeks have thought of it like, no, she's literally like above him. Like she was birth first. She gave birth to him. Like that means something in their head. Again, I don't know if that's something that we can ever really like pinpoint down how people like conceived of those things or like thought about those conceptions.
Right.
But I thought that was interesting that you didn't include Apollo too much in your book because there's so much about him that it's like why
I have to be honest. Apollo is my least favorite god.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. That
Artemis I don't see him as her brother at all or her twin at all. I mean, I think that's something that happened once the Greeks established themselves and we get into the classical period where all the goddesses are kind of married off to somebody or given off to somebody. Yeah. And I think they didn't know what to do with Artemis. They couldn't marry her because of her virginity, so to speak. Right. So they gave her this childbirthing brother. And I don't want to speak for the goddess. Maybe she likes him. But to me, he is the most, I mean, he has a lot of, like, he has a very problematic mythology. He is always, chasing or assaulting someone, or he's down, especially to women, right? I mean, look at Sandra, what he does. I mean, he's just a douche. He's just a douche. And I have friends who love him. I have friends like, who are like, oh my God, Apollo, he's like the son of light and the son of music and this kind of stuff, right? And I am always like, yeah, Apollo, who cares? Like,
and actually, now that you bring that up, it is interesting because again, you talk about this, how she's like a protector of those people, of the of women, of taking vengeance against men that are doing that kind of stuff. And then her brother's like one of the ones doing, like, is that why she hates it so much? Because she's like, my brother's disgusting.
I mean, there are stories of the two of them hunting people down and killing people together. So she does do a couple of things with him. And they do, like, they go after their mothers, tormentors, and things like that.
I was going to say, but is that more connected to just like revenge for their mother, not necessarily like, oh, I want to go hunt with Apollo today. It's like, okay, people are talking about our mom again.
Right. And so I think there's a lot to that relationship that can be taken apart. And so there's some clear evidence that Artemis came before Apollo as like she was already a worshipped goddess, perhaps not under the name of Artemis, perhaps the name Artemis. And that Apollo is sort of a later either invention or something that comes from outside the Mediterranean down into the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of evidence around that, but none of it is specific because no one knows. It's very archaic. It's even pre-Minoan, for example. And so that's very hard to really narrow down. And then because the Romans loved Apollo so much, and then because he becomes sort of like the Roman Jesus in a way, he's sort of the favorite god, right? The sun and all that kind of stuff. he gets a lot of, TV time. He gets a lot of,
Right.
right? And there's so much written about him, and his transgressions sometimes are overlooked by people, or
Mhm.
there's like later mythology that sort of makes up for, like, oh no, he only meant to defend so and so, not chase her so she could become a tree,
Right.
like there's this kind of, excuse around that. And so he irks me. He irks me a
Yeah.
lot. So I
I
very purposely like kept him out of the book as much as I could.
Yeah, I got
Because
that feeling because you do mention him, but not very in depth. So yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting.
yeah,
And actually, okay, while we are talking about their birth story, one of the things that let me find my question I wrote because I found this very interesting. About the basically the etymology of the word bear.
yes,
And how Artemis, I guess we should preface this, that Artemis is associated with many animals, including the bear, very often. Which, again, from listening to the podcast, and I couldn't think of any either, any actual representations of her with a bear or as a bear, as there are with her with other animals and stuff. But there's a lot of more like literary evidence of them calling her that and saying that she's associated with a bear, and these things that are about her as a goddess that make sense to be associated with a bear, and that kind of way like prehistoric lineage of associating this mother bear figure. So
yeah,
I thought that was really interesting that the etymology of the word bear is rooted in this like carrying children, pregnancy, childbirth kind of thing.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to say for that.
Yeah, I mean, so the bear is a fascinating figure. Number one, when I was an undergrad and I was reading, I began sort of preparing what would I do in my grad studies, and I started reading about Artemis the bear. One of my very first questions was like, there's bears in Greece? We don't associate bears with Greece,
Right.
and then of course you look it up, and in the northern part of Greece there's lots of bears, brown
Mhm.
bears especially. So I was like, oh my God. Um, and then her association with the bear makes sense because it's both, let's say, pre-classical period, because of that whole childbirth mothering. She's one of the most fascinating figures because she is a protector of children and a goddess of childbirth that never has children and never gives birth.
Right.
She's in this paradox. She's a really fascinating figure, right? When you think about mother goddesses, they tend to have a child, some
Hmm.
kind of child,
Right. Right.
right? Even Aphrodite has a child, right?
Yeah.
um, and so I found that paradox fascinating because so many women would leave things like their placenta,
Mhm.
their girdles, like numerous children would leave toys, numerous representations or worship tactics or rituals around her as a mother, as a caring of children, as a mother figure.
Yeah.
And so I think the bear comes into play there very, very powerfully because the bear tradition, especially the bear mother,
Hmm.
traditionally was seen as like the ultimate mother figure, the most caring, the most loving, firm,
Hmm.
right? Protective, all of these.
Right. And as you say, these two sides of caring and loving, but also vicious and
Right?
protective. Like, yeah.
Yeah. And it really fits her. I think the bear fits her better than, let's say, someone like Demeter, um,
Hmm.
who is a very protective mother of Persephone. But I think the bear allows Artemis to protect all the children and
Hmm.
to protect all the mothers. There's a more like intense sort of responsibility there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's really fascinating when I started looking at bear cults, especially mother bear cults.
Hmm.
It's really fascinating. And interestingly, very recently, I had the most intense like dreams about bears.
Ah,
And yeah,
yeah.
and they were like breaking into my house. I can't remember if I talked about this on the podcast or not, but in my dreams, they were breaking into my house and opening the doors and coming
Yeah.
for me. And when I would wake up, I would be like, I think that's Artemis. Like, I mean, in a dream,
Yeah. But yeah,
uh,
no, that's really interesting.
who dreams? I never dream about bears, but I had
Yeah.
this period when I was working on stuff that like every night I had these dreams about bears, like bargaining into that. Not scary, like they're going to attack me, but like I was running away and they were coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, I thought to myself, I wonder if her worshipers had these moments that then
Right.
connects you not just on an academic level, but like on a spiritual level almost to this.
Right, right. And I was even going to say, even just across ancient cultures, pretty generally, dreams are a much more spiritual thing to be analyzed in spiritual contexts and stuff. So it's really interesting, like
Yeah.
how people view that kind of thing today, and thinking about how they would have viewed that then. If they would have been having dreams about bears and stuff, would they have woke up right away saying, "Artemis gave me this sign. Artemis came to me."
100% they would have.
You know,
100%.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's really interesting.
Fascinating.
Okay, another question I had, since you have brought up a few times Persephone and Demeter, which again, of course, you wrote about in the book, but I'm really like sure about the concept, because you're talking about how Artemis, if I'm getting this right, is
Yeah.
potentially thought of as like another daughter of Demeter in a way
Yeah.
sometimes. So
Yeah.
honestly, I was kind of confused because I've never heard that before either. And of course, this is such a famous mother-daughter relationship between Demeter and Persephone. Kind of a competition between who, not between them actually, but like who's even the more popular one
Yes.
of them. And then like throwing Artemis into that too is a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah, yeah. The reason why I started thinking about that and stating that was that I kept coming across temples and places where it would be Demeter and Persephone and Artemis,
Yeah.
or Demeter and Persephone and a mysterious woman that was holding
Mhm.
torches, and Artemis holds torches.
Mhm.
And I had that come up several times, and I thought to myself, that's really interesting. Like, what is that about? Because you never hear anything about that relationship at all in
Right.
popular culture or anything like that, right? You're like,
Mhm.
okay. And it has to do with like Artemis Phosphorus, which is Artemis's torchbearer. And
Okay.
even at Eleusis, where the Eleusinian mysteries were
Mhm.
taking place, there is a temple for Artemis. You know, to be fair, that temple was put there during the Roman period, but there is this story in history that Artemis is one of the torch bearers
Mhm.
of Demeter and Persephone as they're going through the mysteries.
Right. Okay.
And so,
Interesting.
yeah. And so I'm not exactly sure even now what that connection is, because what
Yeah.
we have for that is a lot of material culture and a little bit of
Mhm.
Pausanias.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah.
So you have to kind of infer from it. It
Yeah.
doesn't say, there's nothing that I found, and if anyone else finds that would be really lovely if they shared, but there's nothing that I found so far that says um Artemis is here because of this. I mean, they say
Right.
Artemis is holding the torch and she sits on the right hand of Demeter, at the right hand of
Right.
Demeter. Persephone sits on the left. So we've got some statues, we've got some descriptions, but why? I can't tell if Artemis is a bodyguard of some kind or a
Right.
leader of some
Right. But I
kind.
mean, either way, she's being directly associated with the
Yeah.
mysteries, which leads into other things I was going to bring up about her titles and things like that, which you already mentioned a few different ones, which is a common thing in, again, ancient history in the Greek world of gods and goddesses having these different aspects about them that have
Yeah.
different titles and different focuses.
Mhm.
But yeah, so the stuff with the mysteries, of course, is always an interesting one to people because it's literally a mysterious thing. It's something that's even harder for us to wrap our head around than
Yeah.
other things in ancient history. And yeah, I just thought that was really interesting because then you were connecting it to people evoking her for like a painless death and
Yes.
things like that. So is that
Yes.
why she would, because she's so connected with the hunt and whatever? So then did it evolve from her evoking people evoking her for these other things that are associated with death, and like give me an easy hunt that's still praying to kill something easily.
Yeah.
So then associating that with them also having a
Yeah. I
death.
mean, one of her names is Savior, which is really fascinating. And
Mhm.
we are told that she offers salvation with her arrows, and
Exactly.
that there are even Penelope in the Odyssey has a moment where she prays to Artemis for a soft or easy death.
Hmm.
And so there does seem to be a tradition of Artemis granting an easy death or a painless death, which again
Right.
is fascinating, that there is a kind of salvation. And then if you add to that her chthonic aspect with Hecate, right? Because she's
Mhm.
holding the torches. And torches are usually light bringer of light in the darkness.
Right.
It has to do with going into the underworld and coming back up, or bringing light into the underworld. There's a lot of associations there. And I mean, the Statue of Liberty still holds a torch. I mean, this is a very powerful image.
Yeah.
And so there is this complex version of Artemis that is not even a huntress in that sense. I mean, she's using her arrows, for example, to give you a good death. But then in that case, her arrows are arrows of salvation. So if you're sick or if you're in pain,
Right.
you pray to her for an easy death, and she grants it. There are stories in which she comes to grant it.
Yeah.
When the person dies, we don't know. Again, there's that myth versus reality. But
Yeah.
you know, the others around that person go, oh, they prayed to Artemis and she came and granted their wish. And so there's something very powerful there. I mean, if you think about it, no other goddess in the Olympic pantheon does that. You know, no
Right,
other
right.
goddess
It's more
right.
like Athena's more vengeful, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So no, I also thought that was really interesting, because it's something that's so relatable to people. No one's like, oh, I want to die a really painful death. Like, you know. So yeah, so it's a very relatable thing to what people would still do now. I mean, people play. Obviously, I'm in America, so biggest religion, of course, is Christianity and stuff, and people pray for that kind of stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And big associations with Jesus being the savior and similar things. So
and the idea that her arrows can grant both punishment and reward.
Exactly. Yeah. I also thought that was a really interesting aspect of it too. But so again, another question I had while we're talking about different incarnations of Artemis is Artemis strangled. You briefly talk about that, and I thought that was really interesting, because it's bringing in again something that is just an ancient Greek concept that we don't think about it the same anymore when we think of the word strangled. Which we would associate with like suffocation and dying, and that's not how they thought of it. So again, if you're just reading the surface level of this stuff, you might read that and be like, oh, that's so crazy, Artemis strangled. And then they have that whole little story about the kids like tying the rope around the statue and stuff. But like, really, it's not in that context too much.
So that's one of my favorite stories of her, because it has to deal with the concept of both sort of menstruation and procreation, but also parthenogenesis. So the myth around that is that the kids were playing with the statue, and then the kids were put to death, and she was upset. But the most important aspect of that I think people overlook is the fact that she could withhold procreation or menstruation, and therefore procreation. And so the strangle part is the girdle, right? The strangling of the girdle, the closing of the uterus. And this actually harkens back to an archaic, again, pre-Mycenaean, pre-Minoan concept that priestesses of goddesses, and this includes Hera, interestingly, that priestesses of the goddess, I don't know, let's say a couple of thousand years before classical Greece, knew the secret of birth control, but also of being able to birth without the help of a male, of a man at all. And so that is a mystery, and there's lots of debate around it, But what's important is not whether or not this is scientifically possible. What's important is that there was a belief in this mystery. And there's a belief that this knowledge, this mysterious knowledge, was in the temples. And this makes it all the way down to classical Greece, where these women in these villages stop menstruating and therefore stop procreating. And then the villagers associate it with this incident with the Artemis statue. And then it becomes such a phenomenon that they give her the name of Artemis strangled. And then they make sure to worship her in the way that she, to offer sacrifice to her. And originally that was probably human sacrifice, right? And then it became, animal sacrifice once human sacrifice fell out of favor. But it's fascinating because it's very modern in a way. It's a form of sort of mysterious birth control, right? Like you might have learned the secrets or the mysteries of that in temple with priestesses.
Mhm.
Um, and that's really powerful, I think. I don't think
Yeah.
we talk about it that enough
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
with
That's
any other goddess too. Yeah.
right, right, exactly. And actually, you're segueing perfectly into my next questions. My next one was about the priestesses of Artemis because you briefly touch on there's evidence that the priestesses of Artemis had kind of like more freedoms and flexibility than women in general, for sure,
Yeah.
in the Greek world, but like of other priestesses and stuff too. So if you can talk a little bit about that, because I thought that was very interesting. The duality of it too. Like a lot of times, if you have a virginal goddess, then their priestesses are virgins. Like I was talking with my boyfriend, like the Vestal virgins in Rome and stuff. Totally
Right.
different. Like if they're accused of not being virgins anymore, they're buried alive.
That's right.
So I thought the difference between the priestesses of Artemis was very interesting because I haven't heard things like that about other priestesses.
Yeah. I find that so there's so much. That's a great question because there's so much to say. So the priestess, so we have certain liberties. Certainly we have a liberty of, well, of course, education as always. Wearing shorter skirts is always really special to Artemis. Learning how to hunt, ride horses. So physical activity outside was very important. There is the priestess of Artemis in Sparta. She stands there with the cult statue as the men are flogging themselves around her and allows like all that blood. So there's also an aspect of like goriness. There's an aspect of being around men and you know having this freedom to move around. They can step outside of the temple. There's all of those aspects. One of my favorite things about Artemis is that this idea of virginity is very much in its original Greek translation, which is very much about piety
Mhm.
versus hymen virginity. And so to Artemis, it's the piety, the loyalty to the female cause.
Right.
Because she does get upset when the priest, like Callisto, for example, or some of her crew are either seduced by men or mess around with men.
Mhm.
So one of the modern proposals or theories that comes out of the tradition of Artemis's entourage and priestesses is that perhaps Artemis is like one of the first lesbian goddesses. That
Oh, I haven't heard that.
perhaps so that because there's never so when we talk about Artemis, we talk about she doesn't have sex with men. Okay, great.
Mhm.
Um, but she doesn't, there's nothing about her against men or anything. She doesn't like men who sneak up on her and, of course, see her without her permission. So there's a consent issue there. But
Right.
what she really gets upset about is she's very possessive about Iphigenia. She's possessive about Callisto. She's very possessive about her girlfriends, her
Yeah.
best friend. And so there's these theories that are coming out saying, I mean, were they not intimate? I mean, the Greeks would not have written down, unless it was very blatantly obvious, the sexual relationships between women.
Right.
It was not of interest. It was not even, I don't think, very much talked about or noticed, but it was also not really frowned upon either.
Mm.
So, though there is no real evidence to say, oh, yes, Artemis may have preferred all her, because she does say, to Zeus. I mean, Homer does tell us, or one of the hymns to Homer does do say that she's asked for, I don't know, 60 or 30 women to
Mm.
be her entourage. So she's always wants to be surrounded by women. She always wants to be with women. She has all these female relationships. That's not that unusual. That doesn't necessarily point to that kind of sexuality, but there's this very jealous, possessive aspect of her.
Yeah.
And I think early historians were like, oh yeah, she's mad because they had sex and they were no longer virgins. And modern scholars are like, well, is she really mad about that? It's not made clear.
Right.
Uh, it's not made clear. She feels more betrayed. There's definitely the
Right.
terminology around betrayal. So, anyways, that's one of the exciting kind of theories and possibilities that's coming out
Yeah.
of the fact that her priestesses were a lot like besties to
Right.
her, as opposed to sort of submissive, and the
Mhm.
fact that they had more freedom, and
Mhm.
that like literally historically they had freedom, of course, in the towns and in the cities where they worshipped her, but because they were hers, they were allowed a little more independence. They were
Yeah.
allowed more independence,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Less
Exactly.
covering up, that kind of stuff.
Right, right, exactly. Because I also get the sense that a lot of priestesses for other gods and goddesses, it's still this like male body controlling that
Yes.
priestess then.
Yes.
And it doesn't seem like that as much with Artemis.
No.
Which
No.
might have been the case, but not, yeah. It doesn't seem like it's in the same way.
Yes.
um,
Yes.
so to kind of go after, I should have asked this at the beginning actually, but I was very interested in the etymology of Artemis's name. You mentioned that it potentially isn't really like Greek
It's
etymology,
not Greek
the
for
origin
sure.
of the name. So I was
Yes.
very curious about what it is, where it comes from.
So we don't know. So scholarship seems to lean towards Asiatic, Middle Eastern.
Mhm.
Um, when you look at Artemis of Ephesus, there may be some pre-Ephesian goddesses that were already there. There is also an association with the Amazons,
Mm.
but it depends on where people
Yeah,
think
if
the
she
Amazons.
associated with the Amazons a lot,
Yeah,
I can imagine.
yeah, yeah. And so all that we know for sure 100% is that it's not Greek, which is
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah.
So this tells us that her name was so important, or I don't know, yeah, important is really the word, that whenever the Greeks became the Greeks, let's say by the time we get to the classical period,
Mhm.
they couldn't change it, or they preferred to keep it, or they really liked it, or whatever it was. And so I think I think most people lean towards Middle Eastern, perhaps
Mhm.
Asiatic, depends on where you're defining that geography. But definitely not Greek. And it's a bit of a mystery still,
Right.
because there's no other let's say pre-Artemis goddess that even has a name that's similar. Um,
Right.
People talk about Britomartis, for example, in Crete. They talk about Eileithyia as well. But that's great. I mean, there's probably some overlap there,
Yeah.
but there's no, as far as etymology of it, there's no
Yeah.
real connection there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it remains a mystery.
Right. Maybe one day we'll find a tablet
I mean,
at the
maybe because
Artemis Museum.
yeah, my hope is that because there hasn't been very much done,
Mhm.
that my hope is that it is there somewhere and we just haven't
Right.
looked at it. That's really
Right.
my hope, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That would be wonderful.
Right.
And well, okay, well, you talk about this connection. Because so in this book in particular, which as you've explained, you are going to write more on some different aspects of her. You talk mostly about her Egyptian and Minoan roots. So I was curious about the like Mesopotamian connections to it too. Is that going to be another book, etc.? And then going beyond that, if you ever did or plan on doing research about connections in this more overarching like huntress, mother goddess, protector figure of like completely unconnected cultures like Mesoamerica or Eastern Asia or something.
So the answer to that is also yes for all of it. But so I would say, as far as Mesopotamian, if we're talking about Sumerian, Babylonian
Mhm.
goddesses, things like that, Ishtar, Isis, there are some connections. However, they are a bit loose.
Mhm.
And so some people will say, well, she's Artemis of Ephesus is definitely connected to Isis. I agree. Like there is a connection there that could be almost traced or followed.
Mhm.
Um, but finding the other Mesopotamian connections to Artemis, the problem I think with Artemis is that she's the mistress of the wild and the mistress of the hunt. And yeah, the mistress of animals as well. There is a lot of history in Mesopotamia of the mistress of animals, the Padniatheron. And so there may be a connection there, but the names are a little more complicated to connect directly. Again, her name kind of stumbles us a bit,
Yeah.
it's like, right? Now, as far as moving in other spaces, well, actually, that's very similar issue. So in Northern Europe, for example, there is a hunter goddess called Skadi. In the Balkans, there is a hunter goddess that is just a hunter goddess, or
Mhm.
a deer goddess. In Celtic mythology, there's a deer goddess.
Uh-huh.
So I would like to, that's my future purpose
Mhm.
goal is to see if I can connect that to Artemis. Sometimes you have to connect that to Diana because it
Right. Yeah.
depends, right?
Yeah.
Like in
Or,
Bulgaria and stuff, like in the
right.
Eastern.
Or I was even thinking of it in more of this like what is the draw of humans to have this like archetypal mother goddess figure, even though there's of course differences between different cultures. And I know like nothing about Mesoamerican whatever, but I can guarantee you there is some mother goddess figure in
Oh
various
yeah.
Mesoamerican
Oh yeah. There's definitely mother goddess or creator goddess figures in
Right,
Mesoamerica. That's not as much my field. It's a bit of a complex field.
right,
But I would love to collaborate with someone that is an
right.
expert in Mesoamerica and that notices maybe these kinds of connections and says, "Hey, Carla, like that would be really fascinating. Did you know about this, this, and that?" Sometimes it's hard, like when it's not your area of
Oh yeah.
expertise, right?
No, right. Like you said, it's like the artist. That's how ancient studies works, you guys. You have to pick an extremely niche thing to be your topic. So of course I get that. But like, yeah, thinking of this context of
Yeah.
even like, of course, like comparing their names and stuff like that too, but really this like way prehistoric idea of like, you think of the Venus figurines and
Yes.
stuff like that, like even making
Yes.
connections to that, which you did in the book a little bit.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yeah, I think like you can make some connections that are acceptable because there seems to be sort of a line that's kind of coming down.
mhm,
And definitely the hunter goddess, like I just realized how much Eastern Europe, and that's why I wanted to go out there, has of a hunter goddess, but no one has, well, Eastern European, well, they just came out of communism about 20, 30 years ago. So their museums are already have not really been researched, haven't
yeah.
really been, And so I come from Eastern Europe and I was saying to my mother, like, I don't remember going to museum when I was a kid to look at like pre-Roman material.
Right,
There's a
right.
lot of Roman material and then there's of course a lot of modern history material. But so for example, in my country, we have the Dacians, which were tribal people, and they have a hunter goddess.
Mhm.
And it's like, where is that material? And even my parents are like, I don't know what museum that might be in. Like, I don't. So
Right.
that's kind of stuff that you got to really, in places that have had a long time under communism, like you got to really go dig that. But
Mhm.
I do think there is, like, I have seen stories, like scraps of pieces here and there. And so that's really exciting. It would be to, see what this hunter goddess situation and this sort of goddess
Right,
of the wilderness, like, what is it that makes people have this divinity among their other divinities? Like there seems to
right.
be something about that. And it's usually a goddess, which is fascinating to me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly why I thought that was it. Because right, there are examples of it in other places that we know about already, whether we super research them or not. But yeah, having it being again in this what's seen of as a male role, like comparing it to classical Greece, women really did not go
Right.
out and do a lot. They definitely weren't hunting
Right.
and stuff.
Right.
But then this main goddess that men would be praying to for a good hunt and stuff is a goddess.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, again, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
So you guys, we have had a great chat. I have so many more questions I could ask. Please, if you have any last questions to send in the chat, send them now. But the last thing I will ask/bring up, which we did touch on a little bit, but about like your next books coming out, and specifically, I know that probably one about Ephesus because there's a ton of stuff about Artemis of Ephesus. And real quick, I'm just going to say, I'm going to send this in the chat, a link to this wonderful YouTube video that we didn't even bring this up, but it's in the book. So buy the book and read it. We also have a lot of stuff that's ancient kitchen stuff. So, Carla talks about these little cakes that they would make, these honey cakes that are shaped like deer to
Yeah.
give as an offering to Artemis. So I just love that. Of course, there's specific mythology and stories going along with it. So I'm definitely going to send that in the chat still, even though we didn't mention it too much. But yes, so what do you have coming next?
Yeah, I should say that those cakes are delicious. Is that we made them. Ancient Blogger and I made them, and they were delicious.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and he even has a video where he's like tasting them and eating them and how they came out. It was so good.
Nice.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. So my next book will be on Artemis of Ephesus, and there's been some sort of new developments there. And then after that, I think I'm going to do Artemis in Sicily because she's got several temples there that almost no one talks about in
Mm-hmm.
Syracuse and Sicily. And then eventually I will get to Eastern Europe and the Balkans if grants and research funding allows.
Right.
But yeah. So
Great. Love that. Well, okay, you guys, perfect timing. We're right on the hour, or at least on my clock. So everyone, again, thank you so much for joining us. Real quick, I'm gonna put the QR code for the book back on the screen if you want to check it out. It's like $25 at this link. A great quick read. So do check it out. And of course, Dr. Ionescu's other projects like the Goddess Project podcast, which also is on YouTube, and the Artemis Center. Again, I will send your link tree in the chat right now so people can easily find all of that.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. And hopefully we will have you back on for your next books that come out.
I would love that. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and
Yes,
talking about Artemis. I like live for these
Yes.
conversations.
Yes, us too. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who was watching. We will see you next time. And again, don't forget about our birthday bash. Starts on Monday. We will be having another live stream on Monday. So go RSVP and check that out. We'll see you then. Thank you, guys.
Bye.